Ladies and gentlemen, here we are. Bare feet because we were walking in the river earlier, so boots are drying. And now we got that much left to do. And I've been sanding with this orbital. This flex orbital, holy crap. Honestly, all flex tools are amazing except for the radio. The radio is pretty crappy. But aside from that, the vacuum sucked as expected. I actually have it in the corner over there. It's a good little vacuum. But so I got this flex orbital here. Let me show you guys. And look at this guy. Fresh paper and a full charge fresh battery. Look at this thing. It's even got just like a little port that slides in off of my rigid vacuum. So I'm gonna plug that back in. That way all the dust is going into the vacuum. And we've basically sanded everything back here with the flex orbital. So we're going to be staining this probably today or tomorrow. And yeah, got to stain everything. But this is basically the last little portion. Is from where the sander is out to there, back, and then we're done. I've sanded the ceiling. That was with a pole sander. Sanded the walls. I got one little nail head to fix right there. I don't know if you can see it. Oh, right there. That little nail head needs to be cut and fixed. And then basically got to pull these lights, sand this half, and then pole sand the whole ceiling. That's where we're at. So I was curious to see how long would one flex battery on the amazing orbital work. So we're going to videotape this and see how much I get done actually on one section. So I'm going to set up the camera, kind of bird's eye view from this hot tub. I'm going to do the hot tub right here. Boom. Boom, boom. And then we're going to kind of go from there. So let me put the phone in. Oh, and then gotta level it out, and then down. How's that? There. I'm not going to be able to see anybody's comments. And I'm just going to videotape it. I'm not going to try to like do any commentary because you're not going to be able to hear me. It's going to turn on the vacuum. And this is more or less just kind of something that I could use as a fast forward or a video on the flex orbital. Filled up on my liquids. Now we're going to go out there. Not to mention, this thing's actually pretty quiet. Listen to this. Not bad. It's got several modes too. So, this is number one. One. 2, 3, turbo. Let's see how long that took Wow, that battery ran for 31 minutes. It ran until there was almost no paper left on it. I gotta hand it to Flex. Like, that's a battery operated orbital sander moving at like, what's it say here? 13,000 revolutions per minute. So if you do the math on that, I sat there for 31 minutes. Let's say 30 minutes at 5 amps. That thing ran until there was no more paper basically left on the thing. Look at this. Let me just, that's 1 second here. Let me just take off that. Let me turn it back. So the paper's eaten away. Still got a little bit of life, but man, 31 minutes, battery's dead. Still got power though. Oh, it's dead. Like it doesn't even want to move anymore. Now, what I will say about the Flex is that as it's getting to that like end of the charge, right? Like there's nothing left for it to give. It's still got power, but it is a little bit reduced. Mind you, that's 13,000 revolutions per minute on one charge. Guess how many minutes that is? That's like, let me do the quick math here. Give me a second. Oh, sorry about that. I touched something. Okay, so that's 13,000 revolutions per minute. That's 390,000 revolutions on one charge. That's pretty crazy. Now, the reason why I ended up ever getting Flex was because of the fact that Makita stuff. I got Makita stuff. I got like the blowers. They blow. But I ended up getting Flex because it was cheaper. But not only was it cheaper, it is better. So now these tools are sold as a premium tool. Now there is one flaw that I've noticed, and that was even that battery that I had. They have this like black ooze that comes out of them. It doesn't actually affect the performance of the battery, but it can be not so enticing to buy it. So look at this on the, see there's like a dark spot there. And you see that blackish dark spot there? Now, Flex has said that you can literally take these batteries apart and clean all that out and it'll still be fine. They'll even refund you a battery and let you keep your old one and give you a new one. Now, I never got on that because I literally use 6 Flex batteries, 6 5 amps, 4 2 amps, and that's it. And I have like a ton more at home because I ended up taking advantage of a couple sales. Now, you gotta admit though, like to run for 31 consecutive minutes sanding this deck with an orbital sander, non-stop. Like when we started the video, I think we're like over here, somewhere here. And then we made our way all the way over to here on one charge. So it's basically done like a little over half of the deck. And the only other thing I would do is switch paper in between, like maybe do 2 papers, like 2 of these pads instead of 1 on one charge. Because what happens is if you overwork it, you will melt this Velcro and it won't stick in those areas. So I'll probably have to get a new sticky pad for this thing. But this thing has sanded this entire deck. Look at this. Like everywhere. I've sanded everywhere with this Flex. It's light without the battery, right? Like, well made, you know? But this thing sanded this entire space in the course of, let's say, a day. Because I didn't do this full time, I was working upstairs, and then when it was raining, I came down and I did some. But, like, this deck is looking good. All of that's sanded, but you can see where it's the cedar's still silvering, and then we gotta sand this corner and make it look pimp. So I am very impressed with Flex's orbital sander, with their drywall system that they had. That's how I ended up kind of getting hooked on Flex. Was I started with their drywall kit because I had Makita. Somebody stole my router, right? And when they stole my router, I went to go buy a new one. And for me to buy a new router, it was like $180 at the time. And Flex was selling the router, the drywall gun with the feed, 2 batteries, a charger in a bag, and it came with a radio, which I ended up changing out for the vacuum, for $329. I was like, not only am I going to get 2 extra good batteries, but now I get a great like drywall system. I got my router. I got my gun. And nobody's going to steal it because not everybody has Flex. So that's even better. And man, everything in that kit was unbelievable. So then I bought the next thing. I bought the drill because it was on sale. And you could buy the drill and get a free battery. And so I did that. And then I bought another drill. And then I got another free battery. So it came with a battery and got a free battery plus 2 chargers. So with all that said, I ended up with this arsenal of Flex stuff, all because of the great promotions. Even to the point where, like, look at this, I got a 6 amp battery here. Right, this is the next one up from this one. And look, here's a 2 amp. Like, you can literally see them side by side. Drywall gun, regular impact, and I think that came with the big saw. All phenomenally good. Mind you, this battery has an issue and it doesn't want to charge. So I'm not going to lie to you that everything's great, but things happen. I put that on the charger and it like does the flashy thing. Oh, it might charge crazy. Weird. I guess I used the crap out of it and gave up, but it was flashing red last time and now it's good. Alright, never mind. No problem with that battery. So, do these 5 amp batteries, well, they actually beat the regular. That's the difference. Look at that. These are 3 amps. Those are 5. No wonder why they're better. They're just, the Flex standard is better. That's their standard 5 amp battery. In between Makita. So that's pretty amazing. Wow, that deck's like super sunny now. Hopefully we get a cloud. So this is basically how I ended up on the Flex bandwagon, if there is one. But they're just better tools. Like, look at this. So now I slap that in. Now I got the big amp battery. This is gonna last probably another 10 minutes. I'm curious to see how long that one will last for. So we'll put that one to the test. I'm gonna put some fresh paper on that. And this time I will switch paper halfway so I don't damage the Velcro. But I will use the full charge and see what happens. Let me set up this camera here. Here's the flex tool. So let's get that all changed out. All right, let me set this guy up here. I can't see anything. So first I'm going to clean with the vacuum. I'm only doing that to ensure that anywhere the Velcro can grab, that it has a good hold on the actual paper. Because these edges are a little melted just from it constantly going, right? It's gonna happen. The beauty is you just get one of these detailing hoses and it literally just sticks in there, ready to go. So now we're backing up over here. Looks like we're gonna get some cloud cover, which is gonna be awesome. Let me get into position. Now we've got the camera set up in a way where you guys can see better. I'm not going to put the camera out there because it'll be just too hot and it'll just shut down. Oh, there we go. Let's go from this corner because I still have that outer edge to sand. And that hose will reach all the way there. kind of got sand our way back to that corner slightly. This gorgeous thing. What can I do you for? What do you need? You want to go? I get it. So do I. But I still got all this to sand. As if he doesn't know what I'm talking about. All right. The time is 48. Yeah, it's a different angle. Let's go from here. What's Jack doing? Jack is nimble. Paper's still good. That over there. The 6-amp battery gave up at 1 hour and 22 minutes. 23 minutes. Crazy the power this thing has. Instead, this pad is still decent. So the key is to switching out these these pads so that it doesn't like tear them up too bad. But yeah, that's a pretty good life cycle on that battery. We almost got the whole deck sanded. One more battery and we're done. get some shade in a minute. But you gotta check this sawdust out here. I don't know, the phone might die soon. What are we at? We're at 33 minutes. Look at that. That is crazy how much sawdust is on that. And we're just gonna bang it off in the bin. And then blow it off with the blower. Out in the field here. Let's do that kind of where the phone's not directly in the sun. There we are, kind of clean. This thing is loaded with sawdust. Where'd the dog go? Oh, he's over there. Look at the sawdust in this thing. That's crazy. It's like 3/4 full. Alright, I'm going to put you guys in the shade with the doctor here, so you guys can witness the rest of this if you so choose. Hydration. Just in time for the shade. Chunk of shade in this. Ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, my phone's still working. There's still people watching. Alright, so I don't know if you noticed, I went over this edge because there's some cupping in the wood. And I was just taking out that cupping. So, here we are. Almost 2 hours of sanding. Straight with the flex sander. You gotta admit, man. I don't know if you noticed during the video, there was a point where I wasn't sanding with sandpaper, I was sanding with the Velcro. Because the sandpaper came off somewhere, I don't even know. Didn't even realize. And I started using it, and I looked at it, I was like, oh, there's no sandpaper on this thing. Hopefully the Velcro will stick after all of that. And so I stuck the Velcro, and that just goes to show you that even after about 5 or 10 minutes of sanding with just Velcro, its flex still was able to have the paper stick to its Velcro. So I gotta give them my hats off for that. Like, that this tool is unbelievable. It's literally worked for 2 hours. 157. And man. And it's still going. Look, the battery's like almost, it's basically done. But the tool is not hot. Still in. Actually, it's like right around that area is a little warm, but other than that, it's a great tool. Look at it. Still got life. Even on no battery. That's the beauty of these tools. Like, they work all the way until they die. Now, mind you, the performance comes down to a smidge, I'd have to say, like barely any. And but it still doesn't stop it from doing its thing. Just like the gorgeous animal. He's like, so does this mean we're done? Are we done work now? Can we go home? Are we finished? Look at all the fluffies. Oh, you're so soft since I washed you. Look at this beautiful thing. So, I'm going to end the video there with the sanding. I might do another live in a little bit. Let the phone charge. Get the ceiling sanded here. So I'm going to have to spot sand all these joints like I did that one there, straight up ahead. You almost can't tell where the joints are in the ceiling, because after we spot sand it, then I use the manual sanding pole, this guy, on the ceiling, like so. Good old blood, sweat, and tears. So I've done this whole area, and tomorrow we should be staining this whole area, and we'll definitely be doing a live during that time, because this whole wood area is going to come to life. It's going to look amazing when it's done. So stay tuned for tomorrow, probably around the same time, same bat channel, and you'll get to see all this stained. And then I will be like, I have finally finished this project. Oh, now the sun takes off. Oh, you're not on that deck there? Well, we figured we'd take off now. Look at this. Got the step to do. The border's all finished. I just got a little sanding there and in that corner. And we'll be using the Flex multi-tool to do that, which is right over here. Look at that. Bam, bam. Amazing tool too. Well, since we already got it out, Get that gray off. One spot. Da-dum, da-dum, da-dum. Man, you just gotta love it. What a beautiful tool. And this is what I'm going to use on the ceiling. See, the beauty of the Flex is this. Look at this, watch. So I could basically one-handed do this. And then all you do is throw it on. However, whatever position you want. I'm doing this one-handed, by the way. Look at this. And just, it's locked. So what you can do is have two pads, one with 80 grit, one with 100. So when you're sanding these corners, you just switch them out. Bam, bam, like that. One tool. Light, beautiful, can cut all kinds of stuff. Another great Flex product. All right, guys. I don't get paid by Flex. I just am a fan of their products. Their products do a great job. So with that said, I'm gonna get the phone on the charger so that like we're literally at 12%. And in about an hour, come on back, check out Texas Mickey Jack, because we'll be doing these. We will be sanding these joints on that side and have everything sanded so that we can start staining. So till next time, I'm going to charge the phone. Have a great night. Bye.